From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Hello, everybody, or good afternoon. My name is Rob Casper. I am the new head of the Poetry and Literature Center, which is housed in the Office of Scholarly Programs. And I'm in here this afternoon in place of Carolyn Brown, the director of the Office of Scholarly Programs. Dr. Brown regrets that she could not be with you today and asked me to welcome you on behalf of the library to this afternoon's lecture by the distinguished historian Eric Van Young, which has the intriguing title, In Mexico, There Are No Mexicans, Decolonization and Modernization, 1750 to 1850. This lecture is offered in conjunction with the current 4-week seminar on decolonization during the period after World War II, a joint project between the National History Center and the John W. Kluge Center of the Library of Congress, and funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Before we begin, I have to say, please turn off your cell phones and any electronic equipment you have that may interfere with the lecture or the recording. Thanks. And I'll read a little statement by Dr. Brown. So much of the world we inhabit today bears the footprints of the process of European colonization and of decolonization in the decades primarily after World War II. Exploring that process and its implications has been the subject of the Decolonization Seminar, now in its 6th year, that the library has hosted and that the National History Center has organized. Let me say a brief word about the two sponsoring organizations. The National History Center promotes research, testing, and learning in all fields of history. It was created by the American Historical Association in 2002 as a public trust dedicated to the study and teaching of history, as well as to the advancement of historical knowledge in government, business, and the public at large. For more information, consult the center's webpage at www.nationalhistorycenter.org. The John W. Kluge Center and the Office of Scholarly Programs is pleased with its collaboration with the National History Center in offering these research seminars because they so well support the purposes of the center in bringing researchers to the library to mine the collections. The Kluge Center was established through a generous endowment given by John W. Kluge in 2000 to provide opportunities for the world's finest scholars for informal conversation with members of Congress and policymakers, to bring together the world of affairs and the world of ideas, and to offer these highly accomplished scholars an intellectual community that also includes the world's most promising junior scholars. All draw on the expertise of the library's curators and specialists and conduct research in the collections and other resources of the library. The center further promotes the scholarly enterprise through lectures such as this one, as well as seminars and small conferences. I urge you to sign up for email notification of upcoming events by going to the right-hand corner of the library's homepage at www.loc.gov, scrolling down to the Kluge Center, and then clicking on the center's page. You can go to the bottom to request RSS feeds and email updates to find out more about our events. Today's lecture will be introduced by Professor Roger Lewis, the Kerr Chair in English History and Culture and Distinguished Teaching Professor at the University of Texas at Austin. Well known and admired for his work on the British Empire, especially the post-World War II period of decolonization, he has written and edited more than 30 books on the subject. Dr. Lewis was the guiding spirit behind the formation of the National History Center and is the visionary who conceived, funded, and now leads these ongoing seminars, and in the process has established decolonization as an important field within history. We at the library are proud of the fact that in 2010, Dr. Lewis was the Kluge Chair in Countries and Cultures of the North, and that he is a member of the library's Scholars Council. Please welcome Dr. Lewis, who will introduce our distinguished speaker.
Thank you. I'm a little overwhelmed by the gracious introduction. It is an honor to say a word about Eric Van Young, who, as you know, is the author of the award-winning Struggle for Mexican Independence. We are also especially glad to have a topic, in other words, on Latin America, that is usually a little bit beyond the scope of the decolonization seminar. We devote a lot of attention to other parts of the world, Asia, Africa, the Middle East, even the Caribbean, but Latin America gives us the opportunity to have a slightly different perspective on the process of decolonization, not least because Latin America was the home of dependency theory, the idea that one way or another there was a implicit or explicit agreement between business and government to retard or keep in place the economies of the former colonial dependencies so that the colonial powers would be able to continue exploitation. About Eric's career, it had a little bit of an odd twist, and I say this on the assumption that everyone knows that the University of Texas is the foremost university in the country. And so it was a little odd for Eric, who held a position at the University of Texas, to decide to go to California. Now, this should provide inspiration to the younger historians in the audience, if only to prove that wherever you go, you can rise to the very top of your profession. Eric Van Young.
Around 1850, in the last years of his life, and against the backdrop of Mexico's disastrous war with the United States, the Mexican statesman and historian Lucas Alamán wrote these words: "In seeing in so few years the immense loss of territory, the ruin of public finances, leaving behind it an extremely heavy public debt, the annihilation of a flourishing and valiant army, leaving the country without the means of its own defense, and above all, the complete extinction of public spirit, which has brought with it the disappearance of all idea of a national character, and finding in Mexico no Mexicans, contemplating a nation that has arrived from infancy to decrepitude without enjoying more than a glimmer of the happiness of youth, nor given any other signs of life than violent convulsions, it would seem that we have reason to recognize with the great Bolivar that independence has been purchased at the cost of everything Spanish America possesses, and to give that history the same title as the venerable Bishop Las Casas gave to his general history of the Indies, the history of the destruction of the Indies." And he continues, "What has happened in Mexico has been repeated with slight and temporary exceptions in all the former Spanish possessions, with Mexico experiencing the effects of disorder in a more painful manner because of having a powerful neighbor which has contributed to them and has known how to take advantage of them. These dreadful outcomes have given reason to discuss if independence has been a good or an evil. The question is irrelevant after the consummation of the fact, so much more so since these great events among nations are never the result of prudent calculation, but rather the effect of chance were combinations of circumstances beyond human forethought. The course of events has been such that had Mexico not achieved its independence in 1821, it would have achieved it slightly later, impelled by the great measures of the Spanish government that would have undertaken to prevent it. And as we have seen in another part of this work, a history that he wrote that I'll refer to in a moment, as we've seen in another part of this work, everything was organized in the various viceroyalties and captaincies general in Spanish America, so that for them to be independent monarchies, only a monarch was lacking. And it would have been easy to construct a political system supplying the only thing missing. Independence, therefore, was not only possible, but would not have been premature if only there had not been so many changes introduced with it. Since such innovations are not possible at any epoch in the life of nations not already formed with something of the sort of institutions being introduced. In this has consisted all the evil and that lack of men for the operation of the state, which can clearly be seen in everything that has occurred since the first provisional government that took the title of sovereign. I'm going to begin by saying a little bit about Lucas Alemán parsing this rather gloomy assessment of Mexican independence, which of course starts in 1810 and officially ends in 1821 with separation from Spain, and then during the course of this lecture offer some thoughts on the intersection of decolonization and modernization. But before going further, obviously I'd like to offer my thanks to Roger Lewis, to the National History Center, to the Kluge Center, the Library of Congress, and the pleasant and very competent National History Center staff for inviting me and facilitating my visit. Now let me give you a bit of background about Alemán. If you're not conversant with the ins and outs of Mexican history, you are likely to ask yourself what the stakes are in viewing the interaction of decolonization and modernization in Mexico through the eyes of Lucas Alemán. That is, what can it tell us about Mexico in particular and issues of decolonization more generally, which of course is the subject of the seminar and ongoing work by Roger Lewis and many other scholars. As far as Alemán is concerned, I will admit to a certain fondness for the old gent after more than a decade of research. Someone, when I undertook to write a biography, warned me about the ick factor, that since one is likely as a historian, a biographer, to be bonded to the Biography for a long period of time, you have to develop some sort of empathy with them, or at least not an ardent dislike. And I've asked myself if I'm some sort of crypto-conservative for following Alemán's path, but I have developed a healthy, measured, and I think a fairly subtle respect for him. I've been doing research for more than a decade in a number of archives, and I'm engaged now in the writing of my biography. His reputation in Mexican history is still fairly dark, despite the revisionism that's been going on in Mexican history in recent decades, some of whose architects are here present with us in the room. He was accused, and the situation is still ambiguous, of complicity in the political murder of Vicente Guerrero, who was one of the great independence heroes and was president of Mexico for a brief period of time. Alemán himself, there's no denying, at certain points in his life, in his political career, was an ardent monarchist. He had an ongoing association with the quintessential military caudillo of the age, Antonio Lopez de Santana, who was and through that line, Alemán participates, I think, in the anti-liberal genealogy of modern Mexico. He had a very mixed opinion of Santana, by the way, and when he wasn't actually supporting him in office or inviting him, as he did in 1853, his private correspondence indicates that he really thought he was not only a chameleon, but a man of very low moral and political fiber. Alemán holds a great inherent interest as a historical actor and personality. He was many times chief minister in the national government. He was the architect of the last Santa Anna regime, which turned into a dictatorship in 1853, was envisioned as a dictatorship and went in that direction. Alemán himself was an entrepreneur, very much a polymath in an age when a learned man could still dominate a number of fields of inquiry, and a great historian. A claim might in fact be made that he is in some ways the ancestor of today's PAN party, the Partido de Acción Nacional, the ruling regime in Mexico since 2000, which espouses many of the same conservative values Alemán himself held, including the primacy of the family unit, the redemptive and socially unifying force of Catholicism, and the importance of industrialization as a national economic strategy. While one would not want to press this claim too far, there are undoubtedly traces of a genealogy here. More important, however, at least for purposes of the sort of biography that I'm writing and the talk I'm giving this afternoon, is Alemán's role in the modernization of Mexico. His models here, and those of other thinkers and statesmen of the time, were clearly North Atlantic ones, a point to which I'll return. Alemán acknowledged the energy, the social creativity, the burgeoning prosperity, and the institutional strengths of the young United States in much the same way that Alexis de Tocqueville and other contemporary observers did. But what might have been expressed as admiration was colored very darkly in his case by the perception that U.S. ways were not suited to the Mexico of his era, and even more by the palpable geopolitical threat embodied in American expansionism. His entire career as a statesman was shadowed by the issue of Texas, I should add, and in the last years of his life by the loss of the Mexican territory in the 1846-48 war with the U.S. Partly as a counterweight to U.S. ambitions and presence, and partly due to personal background and ideological inclination, Alemán saw Britain, and to some extent France, as the more viable models for modernization, and therefore the path through decolonization. Britain's stable monarchical institutions, its moderate liberalism, and the growing industrial might made it a lodestone for a number of his contemporaries, and especially for the younger Alemán. In this connection, it is no accident that he much admired Edmund Burke, even while he read widely in the works of other social and political thinkers of the age. Alemán saw industrialization as one path to the future in what was up to his time an overwhelmingly agrarian society in which the major agglomerations of capital really occurred in the sugar refining industry and in the mining industry. Apart from that, industry in his era was on a very small scale, and Alemán in this sense is something of an avatar of later import substitution industrialization, or ISI as modern development theorists know it. In this connection, it's no accident that but he also struggled throughout his mature years with a number of other questions relating to modernization and decolonization. Among these were the nature and limits of republicanism, the role of the natural aristocracy of talent in guiding the country's fortunes and corralling the eruptive forces of popular politics. He had rather complex feelings here because he himself made much in his private and unpublished memoirs of his family connection to an old silver baron in the area of Guanajuato, where Alemán himself came from, which is the silver mining heart of Mexico. And I think much of his career can in some ways be interpreted as an attempt to regain what he regarded as a certain status loss with the petering out of the old silver aristocracy. The role of the natural aristocracy and talent in guiding the country's fortunes, the problem of race in a society fundamentally influenced by an indigenous high cultural tradition, but still in his time dominated demographically by an ethnically marked underclass, the claims of science versus traditional Catholic doctrine and piety. And I should say here that the younger Alemán, when he was about 20 years old, this is a curious, I won't get too much into the weeds here. Biographers become fascinated with the minutiae of their biographical subjects, and I'm tracking this down now. Alemán had a brush with the Inquisition in Mexico when he was a young man of 20 for his reading habits. He was reading things that were on the index. It never came to a prosecution, but it must have been worrisome for a couple of months, and there is a documentary trace in the record, and it's an indication, I think, of the opening up of the opening up of his intellectual horizons when he was 20. This is in the year 1812. And finally, he dealt with the key problem of how to remember the 3 centuries of Spanish colonial rule. To place him in the context of world history, let me offer some dates that frame his life. The year before he was born, in 1791, Mozart died. In the year of his birth, 1792, Gioacchino Rossini was born. The U.S. Post Office was established. King Gustavus III of Sweden was assassinated. The Marseillaise was composed. The New York Stock Exchange was established. The French royal family was imprisoned at Varennes and the French Republic founded, and the first patent issued in the U.S. for a self-flushing toilet. In 1852, the year before Aleman died, Henry Clay and Daniel Webster both died. And in 1853, the year of Aleman's death, José Martí was born in Havana, Vincent van Gogh in the Netherlands, Admiral Perry visited Edo Bay in Japan, Baron Osman began reconstruction of the Paris boulevards, Verdi composed La Traviata, the Crimean War began, and the first potato chips were prepared in Saratoga Springs, New York. Well, so far so good. Before moving on to parse the passage I read, let me offer some background remarks on the concept of modernization. I would not make any too great claims for their originality, but I make them to emphasize what I believe to be the inextricable relationship between decolonization and modernization, even well before the era that most of the National History Center seminar participants are studying. And I would add here that inasmuch as the emphasis of the seminar is on post-World War II, and not exclusively, but largely on the British and French empires, I'm taking you not only laterally into the Spanish Empire, but a considerable distance back in time to the 18th and 19th century. But I think many of the issues that I'm going to frame here in the time remaining to me can raise interesting questions about processes of decolonization in general. The genealogy of modernity is not, of course, an unproblematic one. Contemporary treatments run the gamut from the literary philosophical approach of Marshall Berman's All That Is Solid Melts into Air, to the descriptive historical chronicle of Paul Johnson's The Birth of the Modern, and others in between. In fact, Paul Johnson's chronology, placing the birth of the modern in the period 1815 to 1830, between the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the British Reform Act of 1832, fortuitously corresponds to Aleman's emergence in Mexican public life and to the start of his most important government ministry, and also encompasses much of the violent phase of decolonization in Spanish America, to which, by the way, Johnson devotes very little space, a few paragraphs at most, as I recall. It is against the background of this age and these themes of deep historical transition that I hope to place Lucas Aleman, arguably the major statesman, public intellectual, and historian of his time. This talk, and more generally the biography in progress, constitute a venue in which to examine the way one serious thinker and statesman on the margins of changing North Atlantic heartland attempted to work through the idea of modernity and the process of modernization as emergent from that of decolonization. To take from the developing societies of Europe and the United States what he felt was beneficial to his country, and to avoid or at least control what he felt noxious. A Mexican commentator recently marked, as I noted in the short blurb for this talk, and I think it was the late Carlos Monsiváis, but I'm not entirely sure, he remarked that Mexico had traveled straight from a condition of pre-modernity to one of post-modernity without ever passing through modernity. More than 150 years ago, Lucas Aleman made a parallel observation in the closing pages of his magisterial Historia de Mexico, a book he wrote about the Mexican independence period, in remarking that his country had transited from infancy to decrepitude without ever experiencing the vigor of youth. The younger Aleman, however, was very much a self-conscious modernizer in his vision for Mexico's future, and he was by no means alone in his thinking about these questions. The modernizing vision required a large optimism about national possibilities that shared much with contemporaries of Aleman's elsewhere in Latin America, such as Chile's Diego Portales and several Argentine thinkers of his time, and even with that of Alexander Hamilton somewhat earlier in the fledgling United States. Writing in the wake of the war with the US, it was the older, disillusioned Aleman who looked back upon the first 3 decades of Mexico's independent life as a failure. full of error, chaos, and self-defeating illusions. This gloomy view was shared by both conservative and liberal thinkers of the time, although it was ascribed to different reasons by the two ideological camps, whose interpretations therefore pointed the way to different solutions. Alemán and his Mexican contemporaries did not speak of modernity as a permanent existential condition, or indeed use the word at all. The term was introduced into normal discourse only much later. But rather they spoke of national economic development, an ordered political life, and a strong state as characteristics of the great Euro-Atlantic societies to be emulated. Nor did they speak of decolonization, but rather in terms of throwing off the yoke of Spanish oppression, if one viewed independence favorably, or of repudiating the mother culture, if one viewed it in a more critical or negative light. Mexico's capacity to become modern, although it may not have been put in just this way, was linked by all historical writers of the early Republican period, of whom Alemán, in my opinion, was the greatest, to the emergence of the nation and the consolidation of the state, that is, the process of decolonization. It was thus no accident that arguments among these intellectuals and politicians over politics and development fixed on the process of independence from Spain and its meaning. The practice of politics very much depended upon whose vision of the past prevailed, a point to which I shall return shortly. If Mexico's place in the concert of developed nation-states depended upon the consolidation of its nationhood, the process by which that nationhood emerged must in ample measure have determined its life chances. For us today, obsessed as we are with the history and sociology of those great invented clans called nations, the issue remains very much at the center of Western social science. The occasion of the Bicentennial of Mexican independence last year, coinciding fortuitously with the centennial of the Revolution of 1910, the revolution of Emiliano Zapata and Pancho Villa, offered new opportunities to plow once more this well-worked piece of ground to see if we can harvest any new insights. And we can expect this to continue for the next dozen years or so. In 2012, we'll celebrate the bicentenary of the Cadiz Constitution of 1812, the main charter of Spain and its American realms, at least for a few years, that really set the track for constitutionalist thinking in many areas of Latin America. And just after that, a series of celebratory occasions leading up to the last battles in the Andean area in the 1820s to liberate the countries of Spanish South America. Modernity, as opposed to modernism, and I view them as distinct or related things, can be defined in many ways. Among its chief manifestations are the condition of constant, rapid, and discrepant change in the economic, social, political, cultural, and epistemological realms, the disenchantment of the world from a religious point of view and its re-enchantment from a scientific one, the rise of the centralized and hegemonic state with its iron cage, and the expression, of course, is Max Weber's, of bureaucratic rationality, and a host of attendant diagnostic elements, including rapid rates of urbanization, industrialization, increasing literacy, and so forth. Whether these conditions have anywhere or at any time perfectly coexisted and moved together synchronously, or whether any one of them or all of them together is irreversible, is open to endless discussion. The processes of modernization are uniform neither over time nor over space, nor are time and space themselves uniform within the frame of modernity. They may occur in cycles of acceleration and deceleration. It is not a requirement of the theory of modernization that change take place at a steady pace, but only that it move forward continually and possibly irreversibly. Close to us in time, for example, one may call to mind the alterations in the most basic mental, economic, and social registers wrought in our own lifetimes by the information revolution, affected by the pervasive spread of computers in societies by any standards already modernized. I've just painted what I am calling the impulse toward and away from modernity in admittedly stark, polarizing colors. On the part of the Mexican public men and ideologues, who were rather an unideological group on the whole, as it turns out, On the part of Mexican public men, state makers, and nation builders, there was apparently no coherent, explicit project to achieve any such thing, and concomitantly, no elaborated program about what decolonization might mean, much beyond political independence from Spain. The impulse toward modernity was primarily mimetic, it seems to me, seeking models to follow, for some the United States, for others Britain and/or France, rather than conjuring up programs ex nihilo. From the late 18th century, of course, the inspiration of the British model, not only what Englishmen and Scots, Adam Smith, for example, were writing, but what was happening in the British economy concretely, were clearly at work in the thinking of reformers all over the Spanish world. In political terms, however, as recent research has shown, what was initially at issue for the elite political actors during the Mexican independence struggle of 1810 to 21, to which Alemán was to devote his greatest work as a historian, was autonomy within a revived universal Spanish monarchy rather than independence from the metropolis as such. Then, as the intransigence of Spain stiffened in the face of unfolding events in the American world, and as political fragmentation emerged within insurgent groups, independence seemed more and more the only viable option. Hovering over all the processes of independence in Ibero-America was, of course, the long shadow of the French Revolution. For those of you who may have read, even briefly, in Alemán's great Historia de Mexico, his description of a key episode in Mexican independence, which is the storming of the municipal granary in Guanajuato by the rebels in late 1810, it's an iconic moment. The breaking into the granary, the slaughter of the European Spaniards hiding within, and the whole scene bears a remarkable resemblance to descriptions that Alemán would have read of the storming of the Bastille. Of the many ripples that the French Revolution sent out into the world, one of the most important in its effects on the Spanish realms was the sanguinary slave uprising and revolution on the French sugar island of Saint-Domingue in 1791. A direct outgrowth of the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution so frightened Spanish Creole autonomy-minded elites, and those also of Brazil and the southern United States, with the specter of mass social violence by people of color, that they withheld support after 1808 from a number of popular movements in the colonies, including in New Spain, as Mexico was then called, that might otherwise have garnered their alliance against the colonial regime. The Haitian episode, in fact, points to one of the chief questions of the decolonization era regarding the development of national sensibilities, and therefore any claim that the period grew out of or ushered in modernization. This is the issue of the intersection of race, citizenship, and class, and beyond that, how inclusive the idea of the nation might be. Lest my listeners come to feel during the course of my remarks that I'm posing too sharp a distinction between the late colonial period under the Spanish Bourbons and the life of the young Mexican Republic, I will concede that I am leaving aside the colonial period as such for lack of time. There are many interesting issues I'm glossing over here, and I'm currently thinking these through in a separate book I'm beginning to write on Mexico in the period 1750 to 1850. The first issue of many that I could cite is whether New Spain and its sister dominions in Spanish America were colonies at all. The case has convincingly been made that they were not, but identifiable kingdoms within the universal Spanish monarchy. Then there are differences that this might have made in the process of decolonization. In other words, opting for autonomy within a refurbished or reformed Spanish universal monarchy was one position that gained ideological and political leverage from the fact that these, in fact, were kingdoms rather than colonies as such. For the moment, I'm going to put this aside. It's an intriguing issue, and my position here is that I'm going to treat Mexico as a colony. I think if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck, so I'm going to treat it as a colony. I'm also glossing over the incipient forms of modernization undertaken by the Spanish Bourbons, known generally as the Bourbon Reforms, from about 1760 or so. This was modernization of a particularly etatiste sort in the name of ramped-up Bourbon absolutism and the extraction of more resources from the colonies. So these are two issues of many that I could comment upon that bear very strongly on the issues of decolonization and the agenda of complaints that many colonists had, but I'm going to leave them aside. Let me return to Alemán then. Let me return to Alemán's gloomy assessment of Mexican independence and its sequelae, and highlight some of what he says in the passage I quoted, and then try and unpack that a bit. The extinction of public spirit, leading him to say that in Mexico there were no Mexicans, and the disappearance of all idea of a national character, and he's not talking about Ruth Benedict's sense of a national character, but Benedict Anderson's sense of a national character, a horizontal imagining that we're all members of the same enterprise, and the enterprise is a nation state called Mexico. The question, and Alemán deals with this centrally here and elsewhere, and the question is if this public spirit had ever existed and of what it consisted. Alemán may have had in mind the negative effects in fragmenting the Mexican political landscape after independence, the negative effects of what he referred to in his writings throughout a 30-year period as partido, that is to say political party, factionalism within politics. This shows up repeatedly in his writings and pronouncements throughout his public life, and there are others too who were talking about the same thing. The Federalist Papers, for example, is largely devoted to this issue and how to attenuate it or smooth it within a Republican and Democratic situation. In Mexico, as elsewhere, of course, much of this discussion about political faction and party turned on the question of political legitimacy once the monarchy had been swept away. So this is a key question in the decolonization process. One meaning that the lack of public spirit or his statement that in Mexico there were no Mexicans may also take is this horizontal identification among Mexicans, the imagined community made so famous by Benedict Anderson, that is the development of a national sensibility. Anderson maintained that this preceded independence in Latin America. I would suggest that in fact it followed it and came pretty much later, a consensus now developing among historians. The mechanisms for the development of the imagined community of this horizontal sensibility were increased spatial mobility, the railroads, which really came along only after mid-century, after Alemán's death, increased literacy, the spread of schooling, print media, military mobilizations by militias in the internal conflicts in Mexico, which I think is important, people moving around the countryside. In Mexico, the Mexican-American War may also have had some effect, but it's hard to determine what common people were really thinking, and that's of the essence in trying to look at the spread of this horizontal imagination. There's wide agreement, I think, that decolonization implies in part the refashioning of the locus of identification from metropolis to national polity. But the case of Mexico, as Alemán and other observers of his era noted, throws serious doubt on the assertion that this identification was antecedent to the break with the metropolis in any but a small part of the population of New Spain. His observation that Mexico went from infancy to decrepitude without experiencing the vigor of youth, I think, bears some attention too. In other words, he's talking here about the withering of possibility. In the Mexican case, the initial optimism following upon independence of a large part of the population, particularly the political nation that controlled the fate of Mexico and who were writing and thinking and making policy and being elected to Congress and the political class. This initial optimism was fueled by the providentialism associated with independence, and one great booster of this, of course, is Baron von Humboldt in his great treatise written around the beginning of the 19th century and carried across the capitals of Europe and very much absorbed and internalized by the Mexicans themselves, that Mexico enjoyed infinite possibilities in terms of its natural resources and its positioning in the world and things of that sort. But there are other providentialist streaks in Mexican independence too, not least of which is the adoption by the insurgents of the Virgin of Guadalupe as their chief icon and avatar. Alemán seems to have thought that this sort of optimistic providentialist thought was being substituted for the development of actual political skill sets. In other words, he thought it was basically that providentialism in this sense was a kind of a phony substitute for actually getting down to the nitty-gritty of politics and learning how to decolonize. But he also alluded in his aphoristic formulation to the skipping of certain stages of development in which the political nation might develop more skills to guide its own political course. In part, this was the gradualism of a natural conservative, and in part just accurate political reporting. In essence, he was saying something akin to the fact that Mexico was suffering from progeria, this rapid aging disease in children. It's a genetic disorder that occurs in one person about 8 out of 8 million or so. That's really what he's saying here, is that none of the early possibilities were being realized, and he had some diagnosis of why that was occurring. The third statement I want to highlight that I mentioned was that his saying that had Mexico not achieved its independence in 1821, it would have done so slightly later. Alemán here is saying that independence from Spain was inevitable due to the divergence of interest between metropolis and colonies. He likened this process to life stages, thus giving the infancy to decrepitude remark all the more force. So he saw decolonization as avoidable, and there was also a good deal to be lost in the process of decolonization. And Alemán is famously a Hispanophile. In his greatest historical work, he praised the colonial regime, but not in the unreserved, rather reactionary fashion that he's often been accused of. So he's saying that Mexican independence was inevitable. It was the way that it was achieved that was Alemán's chief criticism of the life course of the track that had been set by independence. The fourth point is that its independence would not have been premature had not so many changes been introduced with it. And he alluded to the lack of institutional preparation or the structure to accommodate independence. Here I think he's making an implicit reference to what he knew of the British North American colonies. Forms of representative government in the Spanish realms, while present at the local level, were weak at the middle levels, and there were politics, but they were primarily bureaucratic politics. This produced in the Spanish realms a particular form of political culture that, when independence came, led naturally to a great deal of amateurism in politics. And this is really a fascinating issue about how people adapted themselves to this situation, never having had a house of burgesses, for example, where they could practice their political skills. The solution in part here would have been, in Alemán's terms, a monarchy to dampen the flywheel of Republican and party exuberance. And he revived that program later on in his career after the Mexican-American War, or slightly before it. What did it mean to begin self-rule, he was asking implicitly, and what sort of learning curve was required for it? How was a professional political class developed? Alemán's remark about the lack of men for the operation of the state was not just referring to the absence of a monarch. This was an era dominated by political generals, the most memorable of whom was Antonio Lopez de Santana, with whom Alemán carried on a lifelong relationship. And I've already alluded to the fact that Alemán was prepared to deal with Santa Anna when he felt it was to the advantage of the class that he represented and to the country, but repudiated Santa Anna at other points and really had a quite low opinion of him overall. There were other talented civilian politicians at the time, people of Alemán's generation, most of them on the opposite side of the political aisle from him. Lorenzo de Zavala, for example, another historian, Valentín Gómez Farías, who was at various times president and was considered by Alemán at least to be a radical liberal, although his liberalism today looks quite moderate to us. The striking thing, in fact, in Mexico's case is not that her early politicians did so badly, but that they did so well, given the conditions. This is all the more striking given the different fates of the leadership cadres in the North American colonies and in Mexico, a comparison that's well worth making. In the North American colonies, there was more continuity. In the Mexican colony, there was more of a break. Most of the great leaders of Mexican independence simply didn't survive into the independence era. They were not given to writing treatises like Notes on Virginia or Report on Manufactures or the Federalist Papers. By and large, they weren't intellectuals. They were military men. A number of them were priests, but they didn't survive the break with Spain, and so Mexico really had to be invented at something of a disadvantage in terms of its personnel in 1821. Now let me tack back to the issue of decolonization more broadly, and then to Mexico again. My remarks today have emerged from an exchange with Roger Lewis at a conference on decolonization at UT Austin about 15 months ago. In the closing session in which I and another historian were giving wrap-up remarks, Roger, with a great disingenuous face, asked us both, well, what does decolonization mean anyway? And I have to say he caught me with my pants down, and my answer was, at the time, was sort of like an octopus spraying ink. I gave him the Bill Clinton answer. It all depends on what your definition of decolonization is. In an effort to redeem myself with some subsequent thoughts, reprising some of the points I made then, in my closing remarks, I'm going to offer some later thinking about what decolonization means. And I offer them in the spirit of exploration. They may be sort of self-evident, I think, but I think they're worth thinking about. And I want to make 4 points about decolonization. 1, in the political realm, 2, the social realm, 3, the economic realm, and 4, the cultural realm, and the ways in which they are interrelated. That is, for example, it's easy to enact the category of citizen in a Republican polity, but to replace subject, but it's harder to perform it. This is a political change that bumps up then against cultural attitudes. So in the first sphere, that of politics, in terms of the political sphere, decolonization is the outcome, although not necessarily the intent of all parties involved. And the book of mine that Roger cited, The Other Rebellion, A History of Popular Groups in Mexican Independence, I think goes to this issue that many of the people, most of whom were indigenous, who participated in the independence movement over this long period of internal war for a decade or so, had very little notion of independence and cared even less about it. So in terms of the political sphere, decolonization is the outcome of movements to throw off the metropolitan rule, although, as I say, it may not be everybody's goal. It seems fairly unambiguous, although Commonwealth status and other typologically transitional forms add ambiguity. Social decolonization takes longer, stretches well beyond political independence, and has to do with changes in social structure, the emergence of new ruling elites, and so forth. In the case of Alemán and Mexico, this hinged on the abolition of the titled aristocracy in the 1820s and its replacement with a class of what were known at the time as hombres de bien, a natural aristocracy of talent much discussed in the 19th century, not only in Mexico but elsewhere, of course, in whose hands not only the political nation would rest, but which would also occupy the commanding heights of a modern entrepreneurial economy and of social status. There is no question that independence opened up society to some degree to people of color. But the long lingering traces of the sistema de castas, as it was known, the racially and color-related hierarchy of social groups in Mexico, on which Odile is written, that lingered for a long time. And one can see traces of it, of course, in Mexico today. Those of you who are familiar with the country or elsewhere in Latin America, for example. Some years ago, I was writing an essay, just to give you a couple examples of the way this has lingered, even though officially it was abolished. Some years ago, I was writing a chapter for a collective Cambridge history, and it was about indigenous peoples in Mexico. And I found that after independence, it was very hard to trace indigenous peoples in the formal documentation left by the detritus of their relations with the state, because the category of Indian was officially abolished. Everybody became a citizen. Now, everybody in the country knew who was an Indian and who wasn't and where they lived and that sort of thing, but it became rather difficult to trace these groups. In Mexico today, the traces of this racialist thinking are very apparent. You will, for example, up until a couple of years ago, and somebody told me it's still on television, see a commercial with a woman domestic dealing with a family. It sells food, noodles or consomme or something like that. And this woman is known in these series of commercials as La India Maria. Now, Maria is very dark complected, has a trenza, that is a a braid running down her back. To most Mexicans, she would look Indian. She is something of a trickster figure. She always gets the better of the family. She's really quite interesting. But there you have it. On the other side of the coin, you have commercials for popular beers. And I remember not so long ago, Superior, which is a popular light beer, was advertised as La Rubia que todos quieren, the blonde that everybody loves. And finally, if you travel in the metro system, and the Mexican metro is almost as good, if not as good, I'd say, as the Washington metro. It's really a fantastic system. If you go down into the metro, which is primarily people of working class who tend, frankly, to be rather more darkly complected, and you walk around in some of the more shishi areas of the city above it, you will notice a great deal of difference in the complexion of the people around you. So social decolonization takes a good long time and may go on indefinitely. Economic decolonization, which under the old materialist dispensation we might take to be ontologically and temporally prior to social decolonization, takes longer still. New polities need to re-enter the regional and global economies within different frameworks than the extractive ones typical of the colonial relationships I'm familiar with. The terms are still highly asymmetrical, but are defined by market and other economic forces rather than by formal political mechanisms of extraction such as tribute, taxation, monopolistic exclusions, and so forth. This is what is often referred to more or less as neo-colonialism, and dependency theory, as Roger mentioned, was invented to explain this. The negative side of this, of the decolonization in the economic realm, was that there was an enormous amount of destruction involved in the tearing away process from Spain, particularly in Mexico, and it had very high costs for Mexico. Alemán himself, who was throughout his life involved with the silver mining industry, experienced this. His family held interest in some ancient and rather productive silver mines in Guanajuato that were reduced to valueless. They were virtually valueless after 1820. And he made an attempt as an entrepreneur to hook up with British investors to revive the mining industry in Mexico with very, very limited success. So the economic costs of Mexican independence were very high, not only in the mining industry, but particularly there. Cultural redefinition, and that's the fourth realm, within the new polities takes longer still, and has been interestingly, if often overheatedly, explored by the development of post-colonial studies. This is why I would say in passing that decolonization is a process with a beginning and an end, and post-coloniality a condition that may go on for a long time. To take one famous example with which I am familiar, the centrality of the Virgin of Guadalupe to Mexican culture. You don't have to go far to look for the Virgin of Guadalupe. You would find her image here in Washington, probably on the back of somebody's car. I mean, she's a very famous, the woman of the apocalypse, the very famous figure. The centrality of the Virgin of Guadalupe to Mexican culture and political life would be inconceivable in any but a post-colonial context, it seems to me, since issues of national sensibility, ethnicity, religion, conquest and resistance, and a host of other factors converge in her figure. Her fate is emblematic of the sort of rebranding of heavily freighted cultural icons that can go on from colonial to post-colonial times. This, in turn, cultural decolonization, can raise questions of authenticity in cultural life, of what is real about colonial or even post-colonial situations, and the question of what can be salvaged when these traditions are re-examined and reincorporated into national traditions as markers of unique identity. There may be a certain Disneyfication that goes on here. My friend and respected colleague Barbara Tenenbaum, who's sitting here in the front row, has dealt with this in terms of the iconic representations of some of the Mexican heroes and some of the assassinated, that's the term for it, late Aztec emperors that adorn the Paseo de la Reforma, the main artery in Mexico City, which of course follows the design of Haussmann's design for the Champs-Élysées in Paris. But Barbara and other scholars have pointed out that there are not only a lot of ironies involved in venerating dead Aztec heroes while abusing and exploiting and murdering living Indians, but a certain kind of categorical inconsistency between the way Indian traditions were handled and glorified as part of a unique Mexican identity, and the way that indigenous peoples were and even are treated in Mexico today. Aleman and many of his contemporaries struggled with these issues all their public lives, about what was to be encouraged and what was to be dismantled from the tradition, from the colonial tradition, about what was modern and what was old-fashioned. It goes without saying that these four spheres, these registers, these realms, these analytical categories, or whatever you want to call them, are intimately interrelated and codeterminative. It's hard to suss out an independent variable among them. Let me offer two examples of the way these interrelationships work. In the political and socio-cultural realm, independence, that is, the process and the outcomes of political decolonization, meant the enactment of liberal citizenship within a Republican framework played out within a tradition of racialist thinking. Therefore, we might actually back off from the idea about citizenship and think about effective citizenship. There was a good deal of social engineering directed against citizens of the Republic who effectively lived, and these are indigenous people in the post-independence period, who effectively lived within attenuated or mediated forms of citizenship because of ideas about race, particularly those about indigenous people. To offer a concrete example, the laws of the Reform, which come along around mid-century with the ascendance finally of the liberals after a period of civil war, the great iconic figure here, of course, is Benito Juarez. The laws of the Reform about the disamortization of communally held lands, that is to say, breaking them out of inalienable communal ownership, whether they belong to the church or whether they belong to indigenous communities, had extremely severe effects on Indian communities throughout the country. This was in keeping with liberal ideas. Basically what it did is break open to the forces of the market and full rights of property lands that traditionally had belonged to independent indigenous communities. This was in keeping very much with liberal ideas about the widening and deepening of market relationships, but also Jeffersonian ideas about yeoman farmers underlying and undergirding republicanism. The effects were generally disastrous for indigenous people, and I was going to discuss this a bit, but since time is flying, I'm going to pass over it. But it's important to note that these laws were not only enacted by the triumphant liberals in the 1850s, but they had been on the books in the various states in Mexico since the 1820s. So they go back to the immediate wake of independence and are an immediate product of decolonization. The general point here is that decolonization may therefore have made indigenous people, and I know my colleague John Tutino is going to differ with me here, but decolonization may therefore have made indigenous people actually worse off because of the sweeping away of the protective walls that existed during the colonial period under royalist protection. Another realm of seepage or co-determination exists between culture and politics, and this is in the writing of history, if we take history writing to be an activity of cultural production. Decolonization was not just about structural change, about who governs, who collects taxes, who is white and who is brown, who is a citizen, who guarantees property rights, and so forth. It is also, and just as importantly, about time and history, not only projection into the future, but also about forgetting, erasure, and expunging, in short, about historical memory. 19th century historiography in Latin America was about this, substantially. But also it had political implications, history writing did. The nature and effects of decolonization were argued over by historians in the early decades of the 19th century. The writing of history in this period by Aleman, by the people I've already mentioned, like Lorenzo de Zavala, the perhaps better known Father José María Luis Mora, by other contemporaries who were also political men. The writing of history by these people was part of a political battle. The U.S. historian Joanne Freeman, in her book Affairs of Honor on early Republican history, wrote on the U.S. what could fairly be said of Mexico as well. And I quote, "One man's history was another man's partisan diatribe, an accusation that reverberated throughout the first half of the 19th century, a period of prolific history writing. At the outset of the 19th century, the politically minded came to a common realization. A history of the nation's founding had yet to be written. Historical societies were established, records were collected, cataloged, and deposited. And I should point out that Lucas Alamán himself, while chief minister in the Mexican government in the early 1830s, founded the National Archive in Mexico. Records were collected, cataloged, and deposited, and as Freeman has said, history was politics. Alamán's magisterial Historia de Mexico, in 5 volumes of the late 1840s and early 1850s, which is basically a history of the independence period, from which I quoted at the beginning of my talk, was overwhelmingly negative about the way Mexican independence had been achieved. Basically, he likened much of it to an extended Jacquerie. His own experience had something to do with this. I'm not going to go into this, but there was an episode in his youth when the rebels capture Guanajuato, when he's actually in danger for a moment of being killed himself and manages to get out of the scrape. That may have influenced his views. He and other conservative nation builders also had to deal with the French Revolution, which they viewed in a distinctly negative light, not as the avatar of liberal republicanism and modernity, but as the model of bad copies, performed by their own independence movements, characterized by Jacobin excesses and gratuitous anti-Burkean destruction, where a course of thoughtful and incremental reform might not have stained the new republics with so much blood. Yet other writers, public intellectuals, and historians of Alamán's time viewed independence and decolonization as a vindication of conquered indigenous peoples, and some later also developed a sort of erotics of mourning for the disappeared Indian empires and civilizations, a sort of necrophilia directed toward the ancient native tradition, exalting its greatness and bemoaning its annihilation by conquest and colonial rule, and in some cases even more positively, championing its exhumation and rehydration after independence. Now, there is obviously a paradox here. The claims of citizenship often ran counter to this narrative in Indo-America, in which legal or de facto limitations on indigenous people and ingrained racist attitudes about lazy, libidinous, benighted, and suggestible Indians living in the present day gave rise to a declensionist narrative about indigenous civilizations. In other words, how could it have been so great in the past and is so degraded now? These were 2 expanded examples, then, of how the 4 registers of decolonization cannot and should not be neatly separated. But let me proceed further with my discussion in the last few minutes, so just bear with me here, of colonization and modernization as though they could be separated, devoting my remaining few minutes to the political and economic spheres. What happens in the immediate wake of independence in the structures of rule in Mexico? One sees what one would expect: optimistic constitution making, debates over separation of powers, and enduring struggle over federalist versus centralist forms of national political organization, and so forth. Alamán's evolution from moderate republicanism in his first ministries of the 1820s, in which you can see him in the documents in the face of a number of very serious federalist revolts in the 1820s, basically holding the country together with his bare hands and working within a framework of moderate republicanism. His evolution from moderate republicanism to a monarchist reflects the course of his thinking, I think, about politics, the politics of decolonization. A major issue in the rethinking of Mexico from colony to nation was how to incorporate indigenous people into the society. And this question, of course, endures to our own day. What happened with the Zapatistas in 1994 in Chiapas and the ongoing dialogues, if one wants to call it that, with the Mexican government and the movements towards autonomous regions for indigenous peoples in Mexico, I think are a reflection of this ongoing problem in Mexico. During the colonial period, indirect rule through native elites was the common tool in Spanish America for the metropolitan power to do what needed to be done, since it was more efficient, less brutalizing, and lowered imperial overhead costs, while serving the functional need of translation, literally linguistic translation between indigenous languages and Spanish, and at the same time creating native stakeholders in the middlemen who facilitated this colonial regime. But in the case of Mexico, and probably also the Andean area, when indirect rule of native peoples was replaced by direct rule by national and regional elites, things in the decolonized polity actually became worse for the mass of the native population, as I've suggested. Alamán didn't give much thought to this, apparently, and neither did many liberals. That was just one thing they had in common. To reprise what I said a few minutes ago, liberals believed generally in breaking open the semi-isolation, it was never complete, it was always porous, of native communities and creating a free yeomanry, borrowing ideas from Jefferson. This was one of the essential tenets of liberalism in the wake of independence, since it was a hallmark of market society, uncompromised individual property rights, and so forth. The hallmarks of modernization. One sign of the relative, not ease perhaps, but accessibility is a better word, of political decolonization was the increasingly frequent claim as the century wore on of the republican virtue of New World ex-colonies as opposed to the corrupt Old World monarchical societies. One sees this in writings beginning in Aleman's time, but it really takes off later in the 19th century. As the Mexican economy went into the dumper more and more, although there is a good deal of interesting scholarship now on this question suggesting that things might not have been as grim up to 1875 or so as we had thought, but it's still a question, I think, remaining to be determined. As the Mexican economy went into the dumper, the self-laudatory and celebratory invocation of republicanism in Mexico and elsewhere was a sign that political decolonization was the most quickly achieved of all the four areas. It made a virtue of a necessity, basically. Let me move on to the economic sphere and then conclude. In the economic sphere, independence is not necessarily the opposite of dependence, as Roger Lewis pointed out. The formerly colonized polities often remained informally dependent, especially in the economic sphere, on the ex-metropolis or other external powers. Certainly Mexico did. Or the ex-colonies, in this case Mexico, which was a late industrializer along with other of the Latin American countries, Mexico might re-enter the world economy as nominally independent nation states, Mexico and its sister republics, only to fall into the strong gravitational orbit of a different metropolis with which they developed wildly asymmetrical terms of investment and trade. And with this came political influence. The example here is Britain, obviously, and I'm not going to elaborate on this. This is what happened in the 19th century with much of Latin America vis-a-vis Britain and later with the US. And there are some interesting sub-theories developed to describe the internal economic relations within these informally dependent polities, such as the now largely forgotten but useful idea of the articulation of modes of production. That is to say that part of the same national polity could remain backward or traditional, and part of it could be modernizing and industrial, and that in fact that the two had a synergistic relationship. Aleman was one of the chief thinkers in political economy of the age, and it's rather ironic that most of his own entrepreneurial projects failed and failed badly. He invested in mining and textiles and generally lost his shirt and died a much poorer man than he was at midlife. He did better from a policy angle. In 1830, he founded a very famous development bank for the textile industry, the Banco de Avío, and gave a push to the industrialization and to sound fiscal policy, to sound monetary policy. So he was better at policy than he was at entrepreneurial activity himself. His mature views on a strongly authoritarian, if not outright monarchical state, centralized state, were linked to his notions of economic modernization and were direct outgrowth of his not uncritical attitude towards forms of colonial domination. The political stability he felt necessary to achieve modernization, and the strength of a continuing hegemony of the church as guarantor of the social bond among Mexicans. Aleman's economic thought shifted over time from an emphasis on mining as the strong basis for national wealth to a more broadly based industrialization, beginning with textiles as the entering wedge, following English and Anglo-American examples. But problems he and other economic modernizers had to deal with: the virtual lack of national infrastructure, regressive and inconsistent taxation policies, shallow markets, scarcity of circulating cash, the need to import technology and other factors, put paid to much of this effort to develop industry at this time. With all I've said, he was something of an avatar of import substitution industrialization. His 1844 memorandum as chief of government industry, which bears some resemblance to Alexander Hamilton's report on manufactures, in fact may have been inspired by it. Aleman said in his 1844 memorandum, and I quote, "To be rich and happy, the Republic must have manufacturing, for without it her agriculture will remain reduced to a state of languor and poverty, and the treasures torn from the bowels of the earth, passing immediately from the mines to the ports from which they are embarked, will only serve to demonstrate with this rapid and unproductive passage that the wealth does not belong to the peoples to whom nature conceded it, but rather to those who know how to utilize our precious metals and increase their value. While in positions of power and influence, Aleman advocated selective tariff policies to encourage this. The development of domestic agriculture, he was something of a modernizing landlord himself, and infrastructural improvements, a program not dissimilar in some ways from Henry Clay's American system. One problem Aleman and his contemporaries faced was that of replacing a strong regional structure and weak, because a segmented, class structure with a weak regional structure and a strong class structure. That is to say, to integrate the country and create a modern something resembling a modernized industrial economy. And with it, of course, would have come a national class structure rather than a segmented regional class structure. Federalism and centralism may be in part mapped onto this. Also, the efforts of Aleman and other people to create strong national markets. But decolonization also involved the development of patriotic epistemologies and a new Republican imagining of national space and of geography. There's been a good deal of interesting work done on this lately by a number of scholars, beginning with David Brading, but continuing with Mark Thurner, Jorge Cañizares Esguerra, Raymond Crabe, and others who are thinking in terms of these so-called, it's not a term I much like, but I'll use it, these national imaginaries that depend upon refashioning geography into a vision of a nation that can be shared and glorified in. There is an irony here. This rests on the glorification of difference from the former colony, from the metropolis, and runs counter to the colonial mindset of flattening geography for the purposes of control and extraction in favor of James C. Scott's legibility. Thus, a geography that was perhaps impressive but a nuisance to the colonial power became a marker of difference and even providential election to the post-colonial polity. There is an irony here in that the borrowing of metropolitan aesthetics under the influence of 19th century Romanticism, one thinks here in Europe of the paintings of Caspar David Friedrich, the Hudson River School in the United States, and somewhat later the celebratory Mexican landscapes of the artist Jose Maria Velasco. This borrowed aesthetics was turned to the purpose of creating a geographical uniqueness, mystery, and glory, and then had to be flattened again. That same sacral national geography had to be flattened again to put in railroads and re-enter the world economy on a more modern footing. So there's a contradiction going on. There's a paradox here between the two frames of imagining, since modernization typically involved the reduction of the friction of distance, both cultural and spatial, for the sake of national unification and economic development. Well, let me conclude then. Decolonization and modernization are intimately related. One way this is true, and remains true, I think, is in the genealogical sense, much commented on by contemporary writers, in which modernity is said to be the product of colonialism, and in which the victims of the latter bore the costs of the former. It also meant for colonized people becoming post-colonial, more on an equal footing with former oppressors and more in line with the North Atlantic world, a simultaneous pushing away and an approach. I think Lucas Aleman's career exemplified this ambivalence, this approach avoidance that looks almost like a classic affective disorder writ large, and that he was not alone in this. Decolonization meant freedom and self-determination of a sort, but also it meant loss. Aleman struggled with the question of what to keep. So while he and most other people advocated the abolition of the Inquisition, old scholastic curricula in the universities, and monopolistic exclusions in trade, and while he sponsored the Lancastrian system, wide public education, university reform, selective tariff policies, industrialization, and so forth, he also believed that the position of the Catholic Church should go unchallenged, that some of the sort of secular mechanism of book censorship be established by the state, and that older styles of aristocratic deference and social stratification be maintained within new forms. Decolonization was not only a looking backward, but a looking forward. Decolonization to what? Here is where a selective vision of modernization came into play, moderate Republican institutions, a strong central state, industrialization, but not the secularism, chaotically and over democratized political life, and rampant social mobility he saw in the revolutionary Atlantic. Thank you.
Professor Van Young has assured me that he'll welcome a few questions, even ideological statements, but if the latter, please keep them concise. Yes.
Yes, you briefly alluded to land control of the indigenous peoples, and I was wondering if you could say more about the whole issue of control over land and resources. I don't know that much about Mexico, but economic historians have made a lot about sort of inequality of land distribution, and so on, and I would have thought that would have been a big issue at this time.
Well, it was a big issue. Of course, it remained a big issue.
Eric, I think you better use.
Okay, all right, okay. And of course, it remained a big issue and was still not settled with the Revolution of 1910, which of course is an effort to dismantle some of the larger landholdings, at least nominally, although one has the rebirth of what's been known as neo-latifundism in Mexico, even in large agribusiness and things of that sort. In Aleman's time, much of the countryside, not all of it, much of the countryside was dominated by large landed estates. It was an issue in the 18th century. Reformers, reform-minded clergymen and intellectuals and other people talked about the virtues along physiocratic lines, basically, of the redistribution of land in a more equitable fashion. One did not, however, and I'm quoting myself from a book I wrote, what one didn't see in the colonial period or in the 19th century was a kind of a moon-like landscape in which you only had large landed estates. There was a synergy and a kind of there was a mosaic-like situation in the Mexican countryside that would have varied from region to region, in which one had still viable indigenous communities that worked on a combination of wage labor, typically for neighboring large landed estates, subsistence agriculture, market involvement to some degree, some private property holding, and some communal property holding. Now, the issue with communal property holding, of course, that is, since these lands in Indian communities, as they were in the church before the liberal forms of the 19th century, since these lands were inalienable, that is, they could not be sold, they were owned communally but worked individually on a family basis. That, of course, was anathema to the thinking of liberals who believed in strict individual property, ownership rights, no blockages to the free functioning of the market, in other words. So what happened at mid-century was that the liberals enacted a series of reform to break up, not the communities themselves, but to break open that kind of, what they viewed to be a kind of encysted form of property holding. And what happened over the course of the 19th century was that a lot of that land, in fact, became alienated, leaving by the early 20th century many indigenous communities completely landless. So that there was a shift over time, and frankly, this happened since the 16th century. It's a long process. It has some reverses and some periods when it progresses, but there's a shift over time always in favor of large landowners. And it gets a fillip at the mid-19th century from the reform legislation. Takes a while to kick in towards the end of the 19th century. There is a counter movement with the Mexican Revolution of 1910, but then some tendency, even in our day, for the resurgence of what's known as neo-latifundism. If you're interested in this, I can recommend, there's an enormous literature on this, since the hacienda and forms of large landholding are central to the whole historiography of Mexico. I've contributed to it. My colleague John Totino here has contributed to it. There is enormous literature by Mexicans and English historians and French. I can certainly recommend some things for you if you're interested in pursuing it.
Another question. How can this be? Let me suggest a slightly different approach. Could we collect a few questions before we go on to wine and cheese? Eric, you have managed to give such a definitive lecture that you've silenced questions. And I propose then that we carry on the conversation informally over wine and cheese. Thank you, Eric.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.